Who belongs on the all-time NFL Mount Rushmore? Welcome back to another video on the channel today, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I'm going to give you guys my Mount Rushmore for every single position group in NFL history. Now, I have a few criteria that I'm going to apply to this Mount Rushmore ranking. The first is, obviously, they have to be one of the best players in the history of the NFL at their position. But additionally, I want to include guys who I think have had a big impact on the game of football. Whether that's a cultural impact, whether that's a rule impact, whether that's changing the way that the game is played, that stuff matters for this list. I'm also going to try to spread it out pretty evenly amongst the eras in the NFL. I'm not going to do all old players, all new players. I think it's going to be a pretty good mix of old and new players from different eras. So before I go ahead and get into my Mount Rushmore list, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Our goal is to reach 500 subscribers before the start of the NFL season. But let's go ahead and get into my Mount Rushmore list. Make sure to let me know what you guys think of the list down below. Starting off with the quarterbacks, everybody's favorite position. You guys know, obviously, had to include Tom Brady, but I also included Joe Montana, Peyton Manning, and Johnny Unitas. Now, Tom Brady pretty much goes without saying. I think he's obviously won the most Super Bowls, 5 MVPs, etc., etc. Joe Montana is, again, the second greatest quarterback of all time behind Tom Brady, played in the 80s and 90s. Peyton Manning is, I think, one of the best pure quarterbacks in the history of the NFL. He's a guy that, was a first overall pick, was super hyped up, and was just incredible for his entire career. Won a bunch of MVPs, won 2 Super Bowls. And then my last guy on this Mount Rushmore is going to be Johnny Unitas, who in the beginning of the NFL's popularity, right, in the 50s, 60s, he was the best quarterback in the league. Now, he guided the Colts to a win in what everybody calls the greatest game of all time, the 1959 NFL Championship game. Went to overtime. He won him the game. It was a great moment. And Johnny Unitas, I want to include one of the OGs on this quarterback list. He was one of the first, real superstar quarterbacks in the NFL. I did also consider including Fran Tarkenton for one of the older guys, but I decided to go with Johnny Unitas, just, real OG. For my running backs, I had to go with Jim Brown, Walter Payton, Barry Sanders, and LaDainian Tomlinson. Now, Jim Brown, I think for most people is pretty obvious, considered to be one of the best football players of all time. Won MVPs, was just killing it back when the Browns were actually good. If that tells you how long ago Jim Brown played, I mean, the Browns were a super team every single year with Jim Brown and Otto Graham. And for the other guys on this list, I am a believer that Walter Payton is the greatest running back of all time. When he retired, he had the most rushing yards in the NFL. He did everything. He won an MVP award in 1977. He was a complete back. The way he ran was just so angelic. It was so sweet. Wink, wink. And Walter Payton is, to me, one of the best running backs ever. And then in the era directly following him, we have Barry Sanders, who is probably the most shifty and elusive runner of the football that the league has ever seen. Barry Sanders ran for a whole bunch of yards. I believe he's the third highest career rusher in NFL history, maybe fourth. He's right up there as well. And he, dragged the Lions offense for many, many years, which is not an easy thing to do. And then I had to go with LaDainian Tomlinson, and that's for 2 reasons. One of those reasons is because I think that he kind of represents the new era of running back. He was a receiving threat, and he was a touchdown machine. That's a lot of what you see in the NFL these days. And, he was probably one of the best running backs of the 2000s generation. He endured a lot. He had pretty good longevity. Also considered throwing in Adrian Peterson, and I might teeter-totter on that a little bit, but I think LaDainian Tomlinson is a very fine choice to be on the Mount Rushmore. For wide receivers, the obvious choice here is the greatest football player of all time, Jerry Rice. But I also went with Randy Moss, who I think is one of the most electrifying wide receivers in the history of the NFL. He was bigger, stronger, faster than everybody he played with. Has currently the record for most touchdowns in a single season for a wide receiver with 23. Did that in 2007 with Tom Brady. And dude was just a freak. I mean, he is just a freak. Ever since he was a rookie, he had just been dominating the NFL. Another guy I included was Steve Largent for the Seahawks. Before Jerry Rice, Steve Largent had pretty much every receiving record in the book, and I think he's a good example of a guy who isn't physically a freak. He isn't, super fast, super tall, super strong, whatever. He just got it done. He just got it done for the Seahawks, and it was such a cool era of Seahawks football where they were just starting off as a franchise, and they really, out of rip, had a franchise icon, Hall of Famer in Steve Largent, and it's just really, really cool. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to watch him play, but I would have loved it. And then the last guy included on my Mount Rushmore was going to be Calvin Johnson, Megatron. I think Megatron would be regarded as a top 2 or 3 wide receiver in the NFL if he didn't play for the Detroit Lions. Even still, at his peak for peak, I don't think there's a better wide receiver in NFL history than Calvin Johnson. Obviously, guys like Jerry Rice had much longer careers and much more dominant careers, in terms of time. But Megatron, I mean, it just wasn't fair. I mean, it really just wasn't fair. The guy, he would get triple teamed and still catch passes over you. He set the single season receiving yards record with Matthew Stafford, and he's just a freak. I mean, he's just insane. There's not a better, again, I think prime for prime, there's not a better receiver in NFL history than Calvin Johnson. Next for tight ends, and I'm going to be honest, I tossed and turned a lot with this one. This is one where I really had a few guys that I wanted to mention. So first, I'm going to mention an honorable mention. Kellen Winslow for the Chargers. Played with Dan Fouts, played in that Eric Coryell system. One of the first pure tight end pass catching machines in NFL history. Another guy I really considered was, Mike Ditka. Mike Ditka, he revolutionized the tight end position to be not just a third offensive tackle, right? He actually was going out, he was catching passes, and he was a part of the vertical offense. And that was he was one of the first tight ends to ever do that. But the guys that I had to include, I really think that their careers are just so significant, right? Rob Gronkowski, he was so significant, won so many Super Bowls with the Patriots, connected with Tom Brady so much. He is, again, if you want to talk about the biggest freak athlete at the tight end position of all time, it's Rob Gronkowski, and I don't really think it's close. Next, I had a guy like Shannon Sharpe. Shannon Sharpe won 2 Super Bowls with the Broncos, was consistently a dominant force on that team. He was a vocal leader on that team, and he was really, really good. He was like a 7th-round pick, I believe. Again, a guy that really just beat all the odds to become as good as he was. Tony Gonzalez played for so many years, was just so consistent. He has the longevity probably more than any of these other guys. Tony Gonzalez, it was just a great tight end for many, many years. And then the last person I had to include was Travis Kelce, who, for my money, is probably the best tight end in NFL history. It helps that he has Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. I get it. But, I mean, this dude is he's insane. I mean, he is insane. He's like 34 years old. He's probably going to go for another 1,000 yards this year. He's just awesome. I had to include him on the Mount Rushmore. For the offensive lineman, this one, to me, was a pretty easy choice. I only wrestled with a few guys, and I'm lumping in all the offensive linemen with this one. Had to go with Bruce Matthews. First of all, 14 Pro Bowls. You can't really argue with that. I think he held the record for most Pro Bowls by a single person in NFL history. Just insane. Got to include him. Larry Allen was a guard for the Cowboys, played for a lot of years, and played well for a lot of years for a lot of those Cowboys Super Bowl teams. One of the strongest players in the history of the NFL. And this guy he was a monster. Anthony Munoz, who is, for my money, the greatest left tackle in NFL history, played a lot of years on the Bengals. People forget that the Bengals made 2 Super Bowls in the 80s. That was very much to the credit of Anthony Munoz. He was a dominant force. And then one of the other greatest left tackles in NFL history, I had to go with Jonathan Ogden for the Baltimore Ravens. Walter Jones was a consideration, especially because I'm a Seahawks fan. I probably should have included Walter Jones, but Jonathan Ogden was fantastic for the Ravens, and people really can't get mad at me for that. On the defensive line, the most modern guy is probably the easiest choice in this list for me personally is Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald is one of the greatest defensive players of all time. He's a Defensive Player of the Year winner. He is one of the best pass rushers ever from the defensive tackle position. And pass rush is really the theme of this, Mount Rushmore for the D lineman. Aaron Donald. Other 2 guys I got on there, Reggie White and Bruce Smith, 2 of the greatest sack artists in the history of our league. They were dominant pass rushers for many, many years. Bruce Matthews, of course, holds the record for most sacks of all time. And then the person that they can attribute the stat of sack to is Deacon Jones. Deacon Jones was such a dominant pass rusher. He actually made the NFL start keeping track of stats, and he belongs on the defensive line Mount Rushmore. Next, we got the linebackers, the bone crushers, the menaces in the middle of the defense. Lawrence Taylor is the greatest defensive player of all time until Aaron Donald takes that title from him. I mean, Lawrence Taylor, like if you have never watched Lawrence Taylor play, go YouTube him, go look up interviews with Bill Parcells, go do any of those things, and you'll understand that Lawrence Taylor is the greatest defender in the history of the NFL. Dude used to show up to games like cracked out, probably spent the whole night with hookers and cocaine the night before, and he would go out and have 3 sacks and a pick. I mean, he is just insane. I think 2 other middle linebackers that I really want to include are Ray Lewis and Jack Lambert. Again, different eras. Ray Lewis is probably the best linebacker of my era. Brian Urlacher is close up there, but I think Ray Lewis probably had a bigger impact on the game as a whole. Jack Lambert, he played linebacker for that 70s Steelers dynasty when they won 4 Super Bowls. one of the best linebackers at that time. And then Derek Thomas, he was a pass rushing menace, holds the record for 7 sacks in one game. I mean, that's like a pretty decent season for most pass rushers. He had that in a game. Fun fact, the Chiefs actually lost that game, which is crazy. But Derek Thomas, Jack Lambert, Ray Lewis, and Lawrence Taylor are my Mount Rushmore for linebackers. For corners, again, very obvious choice. I had to go with Deion Sanders, the best corner in the NFL history, period. It's undisputed. I also went with Mel Blount. Mel Blount, again, played for that 70 Steelers dynasty team. What's interesting about Mel Blount is not only is he one of the best corners in the NFL, who's a Hall of Famer, but he actually is the reason that we have the rule change that after 5 yards, you're not allowed to press a wide receiver. That's because of Mel Blount. He was just such a physical corner. I mean, just insane. He was just ripping dudes' heads off. He was pushing them out of bounds. All of that. You got to love it. Then you go, and I got a guy from our era, Darrelle Revis Island. I think Revis really, in his prime, epitomized the distinction of shutdown corner, what it means to just put your best guy on their best guy and just eliminate him. I mean, there were games where he was going against like prime Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, Steve Smith, whoever, and they were just eliminated. Like they were just not going to get any catches that game. And then I had to go with Charles Woodson. Charles Woodson is a guy that I think actually has a really cool career, really underrated career actually. Played for like 20 years, which is very much a rarity for corners in the NFL. Won a Super Bowl, won a Defensive Player of the Year award. And Charles Woodson, he was, I think, one of the most underrated corners in NFL history and probably one of the better corners in the early 2000s era. Next, for the DBs, we have the safety position. I went with Ronnie Lott, Troy Polamalu, Ed Reed, and Paul Krause. Again, spreading it out a little bit in the eras. Paul Krause, the interception machine. I believe he still holds the record for all-time interceptions by a defensive player. Ronnie Lott, this guy was an all-pro corner before he went to safety. I mean, this dude was just insane. He literally got his finger amputated in the middle of a game so that he could continue to play for the 49ers. Hard-hitting safety, great cover corner, very smart player, and of course, one of the toughest players in NFL history. And then I wanted to spread out the safeties, Ed Reed and Troy Polamalu a little bit. Maybe I could have gone with like a Brian Dawkins, but honestly, name me 2 safeties during our lifetime that have had a bigger impact on the game than Troy Polamalu and Ed Reed. You really can't. And that just goes to show how great of players they were. Ed Reed was just a playmaking ball hawk. He could take any pass backwards for 6 points. And Troy Polamalu was just such a hard hitter. He was nifty with the ball. He was, a bone crusher. He could, shoot the A gap and stop you on 4th and 1. 2 completely different players, but at the same time, 2 of the best safeties in the NFL, and I think in the history of the NFL. And then ending off of this list, I had to give some love to the special teamers. For kicker, I had to go with Justin Tucker. I believe that he's the best kicker in NFL history, and especially when his career is over, people will recognize him as such. For punter, I went with Ray Guy, the best punter in NFL history. He was a first-round pick, actually, and people thought the Raiders were fucking crazy. And truthfully, they probably were for taking a punter first round, but he was by far the best punter, I think, in NFL history, and he deserves a spot on the Mount Rushmore. For kick returner, I went with 2 guys. I went with Devin Hester, my guy. Had to put him on the list. He is the best kick returner in NFL history, especially during his prime. And then I had to include a guy like Cordell Patterson, who holds the record for most kick return touchdowns. He's been doing it for a long time. He's been really, really good for a long time. So had to include those guys on the special teams. But that is my video on the Mount Rushmore for every single NFL position. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you guys in tomorrow's video. Peace out.